I probably won't upload this. Will just be a private thought catalog, most probably. But just want to go over all the different threads that I'm thinking about at the moment. I made a very long recording, 3 hours, on the hate speech bill, and there's a theme that kind of culminates into, which I didn't quite articulate, which is a I mean, I'm relating this to my psychological model as well, that and also to feminism in general. Um, I want to make a recording that would be, which this is only a vague idea at the moment, but that would be titled uh, "Flowers, Fascists, and Necklaces." Maybe flowers, necklaces, and fascists. The reason why I put that order is because there's a particular historical correlation to necklacing in South Africa, which also, sort of almost archetypally was, in, I mean, this was a widespread phenomena, but someone who used it specifically, who stands out in the history of South Africa, was Winnie Mandela, um, uh, the wife of the great liberation leader uh, Nelson Mandela, who had quite different politics uh, to Winnie Mandela, which could probably mostly be attributed to perhaps her harsh treatment by the security forces, but and just her general personality traits, perhaps, and such. But she really developed, I would say, quite a toxic uh, worldview and consciousness, and she never quite disabused herself of the kind of the fascistic worldview. And necklacing itself was a very, I mean, the kind of the psychology involved in that form of vigilante justice uh, is almost a kind of mythological. It's very medieval. It's, in fact, that's exactly what it is. In the same way that in the medieval executioner, the punishment would fit the crime, and there was a kind of mythology linking all these things. That you know, if you were if you committed treason, your face would be disfigured in the process of you being executed. Your nose would be cut off in the process, and so you can see that there's this sort of almost anthropomorphized vision of a kind of cosmic justice, which is, sort of projected onto the body itself, so that people can almost universally um, locate it within their own physiology in some sense. And the whole motif around necklacing was that, oh, you are uh, uh, you're helping the enemy. You want to be given treats, and you want to be dressed up, and you want to be given gifts by the enemy. We'll give you a gift. We'll give you a necklace, because that's what you're doing it for. You're doing it for a necklace. That's why you're betraying your own people, is because you want a beautiful necklace. So we'll give you the necklace of a tire drenched in gasoline, petrol, and set on fire, where you'll burn to death with melting rubber encircling you and engulfing you. being burnt alive by the necklace that so that was essentially the moral the morality play in the motif and the mythology of the punishment fitting the crime, essentially. So all nuance gets sort of thrown out of this. Now, I mean, there's specific examples where Winnie Mandela. I mean, I don't want to try, but it's controversial. But and I must say, I'm not even that familiar with the history myself because I'm as a child absorbing these things. But there were children were necklaced for their collusion with the South African security forces, and perhaps there was the whole. I think the history of it is even quite confused to some degree because it's wasn't exactly sure if someone was punished and they were just kind of scapegoated or something like that, or there was something else going on and this was used to clean up somebody else's mess or something like that. Um, but anyway, I wanted to link this to um, this is perhaps too disparate to link this with feminism. It's vaguely thematically similar, though, that I do think that there is something in the courtship ritual of giving flowers to a woman that says something about the man's commitment, or at least a kind of profession of a kind of that they will be burdened by societal conventions, that they will conform to some format which is prescribed by the social mythology or whatever, that they will run that gauntlet and they will be supplicants. And in some sense, the offering of flowers to a woman, I think, is in some sense, I think it also reinforces a kind of latent or implicit, sort of contract, or facilitates some kind of that the woman is allowed to receive things that themselves are not very, uh, let's say, purposeful or utilitarian, that the woman is given some extra surplus, is some surplus is afforded the female role to be able to extract or be gifted something that essentially holds only token value, and in some sense that also is symbolic of the woman being able to demand tributes and tokens that are merely by her uh, discretionary profession of so it's almost like a kind of that there will be a surplus of value which the woman can dictate or that the woman can demand. And I think that the flower might have all of this built into it. That, if let me go and spend money on flowers, let me go and collect this symbolic token, and the woman is allowed to enjoy symbolic tokens and to demand symbolic tokens and express what those symbols might. So she gets control over the symbolic domain. She gets to, um, in her discretion, she gets to place value on tokens and get supplication or conformity to her view on these sorts of things. And I do think that all of that kind of stuff might be somewhat vaguely built into that women get flowers, women get given flowers. I think that these are the sort of the hidden contracts sort of squashed inside of that. Now, the reason why I bring that up is and you can vaguely see the parallel between that and necklacing. And you can almost imagine that maybe that's what, sort of the feudal medieval system in its punishment was putting justice in a way in which everyone could understand it, even women could understand it, because they could physically sympathize with it. They could embody it in terms of their contemplation of it. They could run it through in their own minds. Yes, you don't commit treason because then your nose is going to be chopped off. So there's this kind of, your face is going to be disfigured. That it kind of, that things get symbolically played out or something like that. In almost quite a lowest common denominator kind of way as well. But anyway, the okay, now this is somewhat still vaguely related, but this is a tangent, but this is also mainly the main focus, is that people talk about that the reason why society is falling down and things are disintegrating is because the man is no longer in the family or something like that, or the men are not men are no longer in the household. They're not part of child rearing like they used to be. They have been extricated. They're just used as a kind of economic or financial utility. They are reduced to merely utilitarian instruments in some kind of competition amongst themselves in terms of what they can provide to women. Now, that kind of entitlement and that kind of toxic feminism and things like that, which is fundamentally misanthropic and fundamentally, I've described it even in terms of the archetype of Eros, discordia, and archetypally a kind of lesbian homosexuality is a way of just that this Eros figure only wants to associate with other Eros figures in a kind of in an agreement for extraction from, so it's this weird kind of accelerating spiral, that they can only make alliances with other Eros mentality. They don't. It's Eros looking to make ally with Eros just so that she can form a stable way of extracting or parasitically creating social conventions that scapegoat and blame everything on the masculine. Or so it's that the proper form of Eros, the proper form of discordia, is that you reject order because you want a different kind of order. You reject the masculine order because you want a higher synthesis. But this Eros doesn't have a synthesis in mind. It doesn't have criteria for a synthesis. It's just negatory. It's just negatory in its disintegration of things. It's just rejecting order and trying to find other things that exacerbate the rejection of order with no view as to what would actually be the substitute for what is being rejected. So, it's just fundamentally sadistic or malicious or misanthropic. And in some way, it believes fundamentally that an Eros and an Eros can somewhat make a stable project or mechanism or program of internal dependency or something like that, which, in some sense, I think requires a kind of caste system. I mean, this parallels to what I've said about, that the archetypal third wave feminist is essentially Agent Smith in The Matrix, with his original speech, you're all parasites. So, it always just, it ironically projects what it is itself, that, oh, the machines are the parasites. They're the ones who need the human beings to be used as biochemical heat batteries for the machine world. But he calls them parasites, and he says the humanity is a virus. And so that's how an escape, and so he's dependent on humanity, but he has to ideologically scapegoat them. Okay, so it's anyway, that parallel is, I don't want to harp on about that. So this gets back to my point. The point is not the absence of the masculine. The point is the value of the masculine. Which, I mean, I guess you can say that these things are correlated, but just in terms of the actual diagnosing the problem with society, because I think the problem still persists even if men are around. It's not the physical presence of men so much as it is the framing of the value of the masculine that society itself has cottoned onto this Eros sort of domino vortex of spiraling in on itself. And in some sense, this I would link back to the flowers, is that now we have reduced courtship and we've reduced the sexual marketplace into men chasing women, and maybe some pickup artists trying to work out how to game, the feminine propensity for, hypergamous investigation into how women ideally, or at least in some lowest common denominator form, average out engaging in the sexual marketplace. But essentially, anyway, my point is that the problem is that men aren't being chased by women, which will sound like a very self-serving kind of sort of thing, but I think that this is the fundamental problem with our culture, is that the men that are being chased by women, I shouldn't say men, I should say masculine. I said masculinity is not being chased by feminine, it's not being valued or uh, so even the men that are being chased are essentially, as in they are being pursued, they are wanted. The men that are wanted are, I hate using this example, maybe it's too good, is Harry. Uh, Wait, man, I'm very bad with names. I don't know if I've got the right one. Harry is the one that left the monarchy to go live in the one that left to go live in California. So, they just have status. They are just celebrities, It's sort of, they aren't in any way masculine in any real sense, uh, other than some nominal token, uh, uh, in some sense they are just a kind of utilitarian instrument. They're just a sort of a stepping stone. So there is nothing about them that is sort of intrinsically valued, or at least there's nothing intrinsically valuable about their masculinity other than it being a kind of a glove to be worn, or an instrument that is capable of providing. Um, but it has kind of no actual esteem or integrity or honor attached to it. Its honor is that it is so in some sense, the masculine has been completely reduced into providing the flowers, as it were, and just waiting to hear what the woman is going to define as the next token or symbolic um, target to be delivered to them. So it's this always that the masculine is chasing the feminine. It's never the feminine that is pursuing the masculine or that's valuing the masculine. And so this is the real asymmetry. This is the real imbalance, as it were, is that there is nothing properly exalted about the masculine energy, as it were. Um, and it's interesting because the more that women do this, the more that they become utterly contemptible and hollow and vacuous and superficial. You know, all they do is they create a narrative, is they collude in some kind of ideological worldview that puts themselves as, you know, the sacred victim and in needing to be delivered things and needing masculine energy to be instrumentalized to help them feel better about themselves within their own constructed worldview. So that, you know, they become more and more insulated, more and more encapsulated in their own hyperrealism, in their own surrealist projections of things. And, you know, they're sort of stuck in that matrix. They're stuck in that womb of their own, of you know, in because they want to give birth to the environment, they want to give birth to the world, where they already are, where they already have the thing that. So, you know, it's weird because, you know, they have really undercut themselves, and in some sense the only way that they can try to have a forward progressive vision, the only way that they can have motivation and goals and objectives, is to essentially leverage a complaint against the system, leverage a complaint against the world, in which in which the actual obstacle should already have been dealt with. It should have already been delivered to them as being removed. And so they don't actually even have the let's say, archetypally, the masculine work ethic to actually, you know, do something constructively or collaboratively in any kind of coordinated way. It just gets translated into a complaint, into a whinge and a whine and a moan about it. And then somebody else should spring to action and do that. And they shouldn't even be praised for doing it, because in some sense they should be condemned that they didn't already do it, or when they end up delivering the symbolic um, homage um, that amounts to the discretion of the female realm of. So in some sense, and I do wonder, you know, because, you know, the more that I can kind of, because look, I can take the same theme and I can elaborate it perhaps, and you know, maybe it's that boys and men just got too much into video games, and they got too much into their own world of, you know, sort of jousting and hierarchy and trying, because I mean that's what boys and men have to do, is that they have to actually create some kind of social status so that they can prove their value, so that women will actually be interested in them. And at some point, let's say the world of masculine value, perhaps maybe it turned its back on the female world because it just said, you know, well, women are actually, on average, they're just too stupid or something like that. They're just not interested. They're not sophisticated enough. They only want to play their hypergamous games. And when we actually do things in this technical way, we're actually also making improvements because, you know, as we joust for social status, we're also inventing things and creating things, but girls and women just aren't interested. They want to go and be equestrian horse, what's it called? Triage, whatever it's called. Like they want to, uh, they want to focus on on symbolic, uh, almost what is it, the whole princess trope and all those sorts of things. Although I mean, I think many of the aspects of the princess end up becoming quite masculine, because when a woman is confident in her, let's say, standing, then that gives her the basis upon which to make her own investigations, and in some sense to but in terms of the obsession with fashion, the obsession with sort of social tokenism, conventional, trying to ingrain conventional symbolism, and then relying on that, overtly relying on that, and not looking through it or past it, in terms, sort of being completely hypnotized and transfixed by the social structure, having an easy reading and an easy interface, because women don't want to have to go and work out, okay, well, you don't already have status, you're not already rich or something like that, so I don't know how to judge you. So, like, I don't want to find out how good you are at, okay, this is, I mean, this analogy is kind of wrong, but if you can, I don't want to work out how good you are at video games and then work out if that translates into you being intelligent and going to be a winner someday. Like, I don't want to, uh, I don't want to be part of any kind of project in that way. I just want to, you know, call me when you've made it, kind of thing. Um, so, sort of just gravitating towards ostentatious displays of, let's say, already proven social status within the conventional domain, um, with, in some sense, no appreciation or value of, how any of these structures come to be in some sense. And, I'm just trying to think, because, there's so many practical elements to this, which is that, I mean, it makes sense that in the original sense that the point then of bringing a woman flowers is to say, well, all you have to do is maintain a household. All you have to do is, everything else will be brought to you, and you will be the queen of the surplus value, uh, of the unity, and so, you can kind of see that bargain being struck, within the gifting of flowers. But I do think that essentially the symbolic tokenism of the gift, it has exacerbated into, uh, an errors social order, a chaotic social order that does not even value the thing that makes it all possible, as it were. The instrumentalization is just sort of taken for granted. Um, Women want to interface, through the valence of being gifted symbolic dominion over culture and society. Okay, so I've kind of reached the end of that set of themes, but there's a parallel to all of those themes as well, um, which is now it's just I've just lost that thread in my mind. It'll come back to me though. The what was it? It was something to do with economics. There was another layer to the that women are being gifted control over symbols. Okay, yeah. So there is this mechanism that I think I mentioned it right at the start, but it's no, I didn't mention it right at the start, but I was going to get into it. It also connects with that stuff that I was saying at the start about necklacing. Is that social conventions are often constructed out of stereotypes and generalizations. And this is also what sort of dovetails to the long 3 hour recording that I made about the hate speech bill, in which I was getting into some aspects of psychology or some aspects of basic morality, which sadly I only got to in sort of the last hour and a half, where I kind of refined this, and I also refined how I think hate speech should be framed um, ideologically and within the law, and that essentially hate speech should not be used against normal people. And in some sense, we already have the crime criminally injuria for people who infringe heavily on other people's dignity. But in some sense, some people don't even have dignity in a sense that it should be protected, because the dignity of someone of a fascistic worldview is, I mean, I don't think that that deserves any kind of legal protection. Yet people should have their freedom of conscience. But if you are inciting hatred for immutable characteristics in the public domain, you are doing constitutional damage. You and so prominent leaders should not be inciting hatred against whole groups of people. And paradoxically, I think if someone tries to do this and they have no hope of succeeding or reaching support or something like that, then I think that then actually it doesn't fall into the category of constitutional damage. And in that case, you know, they'll probably be rebutted by other speakers within society or within the general education system as a whole that has already educated people into the morality of non-racialism, and that has enough of a, let's say, a cultural hegemony that it, in some sense, it doesn't matter that you have these radical voices because they are seen as crackpots. But in some sense, we're only vulnerable to this kind of incitement of hatred because essentially the state itself is in a very institutionally corrupt position in which it has already fudged the morality around non-racialism. It's already brought in a lot of racialist policy. So anyway, that's what I explore in that 3 hour recording, which is actually quite badly structured. In you know, you have to kind of wait patiently for me to finish the glaring gaps in some of my thinking there, because I really piece through it very in a very wishy-washy way, but I do end up, I think, thematically generally dealing with it all fine. But anyway, the point that links these themes together is in psychologizing how the race baiting works. So, what is happening in race baiting often and within the fascistic worldview and the identitarian worldview is that what is I think the mechanism that is actually taking place is that a general stereotype or generalization is regarded as holding some water, as being, let's say, a viable stereotype or a viable generalization. Obviously, I try to make this point clear, is that we should not try to stop people from developing generalizations or even stereotypes. The point is to limit the use of generalizations and stereotypes because they're not morally actionable. They're dubious, dangerous, they're morally dangerous objects or instruments. You can use them for some kinds of impersonal planning, and even that is going to be quite so. You have to do it only when you're doing low resolution planning in some sense. When you're just kind of roughly orientating yourself as to where you might start constructing plans to do something in your imagination or whatever. So you know you use them in the stage of framing some heuristics maybe, um, and you have to be quite morally conscious when you're doing that kind of de- delineation of how you're going to proceed moving forward to the next phase of constructing a low resolution plan anyway. So I'm just trying to say that they are ingredients in terms of planning. They're very murky ingredients. They're very low grade ingredients. But the idea that you can have a worldview without developing generalizations and stereotypes is it's just insane. It's not going to be possible. To do that would be to create such a mind slave, how are they going to be able to, they're going to be so unsituated in their own feet. They're going to be, they're going to have to create a society that is a complete control society to develop the right amount of support and security for such a fundamentally enslaved and unindependent and uncritical discerner, because some kind of thinker that can't have generalizations or stereotypes or low resolution models of things is going to be fundamentally without the ability to create a context for anything, which is, in some sense, this is the microcosm, or this is the summary of, the kind of the problem that we sit in the modern world, or the modern mentality, or the modern ideology. This is the kind of authoritarian, this is the psychological schema that the authoritarian, sort of structure this is the solution to the problem of an individual that isn't allowed to have generalizations and stereotypes. So that's why I think that this stuff is quite important. Anyway, but not only do they say that you can't have a generalization or a stereotype, but they almost know that there are generalizations and stereotypes, and then they want to blame someone for the fact that there are, in their estimation, these true stereotypes, and in their view, they want stereotypes to be morally actionable. They want people to rely on stereotypes. They want people to live in a society in which what you see is what you get. They don't want people to be deep thinkers. They don't want people. They want everything to be what it says on the tin. Everything must be what it says on the label. So that's why they have this kind of semantic drive to digesting and reprocessing all of society within their semantic matrix. It gives them an impetus to reorder the world in their own machinations. Um, so now it goes even further than this. Is that so they are aware of these generalizations, and they want to have them reversed, because then they'll bring equilibrium to the identity matrix. Then that's their definition of equality. Is that they want to deal in the social psychology of these morally dubious objects. They want to make them redeemed. They want to morally redeem them. So they want a kind of a fleshly, worldly kind of redemption, which is why they are, uh, if I can just say this poetically, why they are so demonic in so many different ways. Why they have such demonic influences and repercussions to everything that they do is because they are trying to go to war with the understanding. They don't want individuals to understand morality or life. They want everything to be what it looks like on the outside. So they don't want people to be able to penetrate with their own understanding. They want to have an orchestrated top-down impression which is agreed upon. Everyone is plugged into this cloud mentality, into this cloud ideology that everyone is tethered to, like an umbilical cord, exactly like the Matrix. Everyone's plugged into the same Matrix. That's what they want. Um, Now, so they want to therefore use these generalizations as that they want to have rehabilitated and redeemed. They want to use them as the exact tip of the spear to develop the kind of revolution the social revolution that they are demanding. So not only do they say we want this generalization to occur in the reverse, we want to immediately, and superficially that's not such a bad thing. Like, you on some superficial level you can maybe argue that these people have good intentions. I think that runs out too quickly, because I think that they know that the kind of way that they're saying that they want this generalization to become they want to heal the generalization. Well, if they really wanted to heal it, then they wouldn't stay in the realm of superficiality. They wouldn't stay in the realm of wanting to, you know, I mean, this is where you get the kind of fudged logic of wanting to revise history, or you can't fix history. It's not going to happen. You can't change the past. It's already happened. So the kind of thing that they want, they're trying to make an impossible moral emergency over wanting to do something that's fundamentally impossible, so that they can just get their way in the mean anyway. But so they're using this generalization, or they want to use this generalization against their enemies. So they want to find a scapegoat to say, you are the reason why this generalization exists, and they don't want to let go of the scapegoat. And in some sense, they also want to use the generalization as the thing that does the healing. So they want to say, you see this generalization, you, Mr. Scapegoat, you have to pretend that this generalization is the opposite. And this is how you can get the disgusting moral logic of saying we're allowed to use race as a proxy for disadvantage. Because you can say, you see, we're going to use generalizations now, but we're going to use them in a way that we say is going to work for everyone, or it's going to be the healing. So we're going to use generalizations because you are responsible for creating the bad generalizations. So we're going to create good generalizations to override your bad generalizations. And although the bad generalizations, there are some truth to them, but because you are responsible for creating them historically, you have to pretend that they are already, that the generalizations are inverted, that they are opposite day. So you have to live in the world and you have to pretend that it's opposite day, and we know that it's not opposite day, but we can force you to pretend that it's opposite day. And so you get this in some, I mean, because when people talk about double standards, it is more complicated than they're just being double standard. It's a kind of what I've just tried to portray. It's that you have to accept the double standard, and you have to accept that when we say that it's not a double standard, you also have to go along with that. So you have to imbibe the double standard, and then you have to agree that it's not a double standard. Well, we know that it's a double standard, but it's like it's a self-righteous, we have an excuse for using it against you. And so we know that it's a double standard, but you aren't allowed to say it because of the color of your skin or something like that. And that somehow that is going to be the antidote to history by recreating it in the inverse. Now, I had a more simple way of describing this essentially, but that is that you can compel the scapegoat, you can compel the ideological perpetrator to pretend that the generalization is not true. And you can also traumatize or bully the ideological perpetrator or scapegoat when they're close to wanting to rely on the generalization. So they aren't allowed to plan things. They're not allowed to think of the world in terms of realism or pragmatism. They can't, they're not allowed to use generalizations. They in fact have to use substitute generalizations that are ideologically accorded to them. And that is their penance. And so we can sort of sadistically make sure that they are not allowed to utter true generalizations, or we have to make sure that they are policed into denying true generalizations. Now, again, generalizations I think can be true. It's not hard to make a true generalization. It's just that it's not going to be morally actionable against an individual, but that doesn't mean that there aren't true generalizations. Now, you see, all of these points that I'm making are a bit new. This whole thing is a bit nuanced. It's a bit complicated. And in some sense, they just shunt off the complication by the immediacy of demanding this form of reparation, essentially, even though it exacerbates itself and it leads to more, it makes itself more necessary because it's such a disaster to reality and to psychology in some sense. And now, the point that I was going to make here is that I believe that what I've just described can also be described through metagram emotional circuitry. And I haven't, this is, I shouldn't perhaps say this. This is a bit embarrassing, or no, I mean, it's a bit embarrassing to say this, is that I haven't, I've mapped out all of the metagram field circuits and I've looked at two of the mechanics. Um, and it is very interesting because the field circuits are, there are four field circuits, and each four field circuit has parallel correspondences with three other field circuits. So each of the four field circuits is connected with all the other field circuits, is another way of saying that. But they have asymmetrical, it's not an even distribution. So the actual connections and parallels between the field circuits are each unique, and I can also name what's going on in terms of the actual names of the emotional tones, and that really puts some flesh on the on in terms of the imagination of running through how these mechanics work, how these flows work. And you can, I think you can turn it also into, I've said that these are the ingredients of all the archetypes, of all the mythological stories, I think, are all particular showing off the trade-offs between how something in one field circuit can operate internally to that field circuit being propitiated by the other field circuits, or how particular flows will go from one to the other to the other to the other, in a particular sequence, or how you could also have two independent things happening between the field circuits and how these two independent flows can then, with their own particular sequence and history, will then interact with one another. So I do think that you could use this to archetypally, in a kind of, in a simple form, archetypally, and in some sense this is all reducible not only just to flows of emotional tones and how mechanically, how, well, it will either go this way or that way, and when it goes this way or that way, there's a sympathetic concurrence, that there's a simultaneous functioning between these two things that are happening at the same time, which will show the moment of being able to focus your attention on one field circuit or the other circuit, or maybe, there could even be a simultaneous, how a flow could translate into two independent flows that are essentially running from the same base impetus. Anyway, what I was going to say is that I think that this whole thing where people are saying that you can't use a generalization, but we can use a generalization, or that you have to use, you're not allowed to use, you can only use an opposite generalization. I think that will be able to be, I think I should be able to explain that whole mechanism within the field circuits. I think that there will be a particular flow of field circuits. Yeah, I think that should be able to be modeled through the field circuits. So that's the only thing that I wanted to say about that. Um, is that I really think that whole structure of interaction can be related to the metagram field circuits. So anyway, I just wanted to point that out there, but I haven't done it yet, as it were. But so it's perhaps premature to say that. And I still have to probably coalesce some more stringent views on how, or metagram mechanics, because it's still a little bit up in the air. But I've found some beautiful ways to model how metagram and metatype interrelate to one another. But sadly, that model, or that I've done, does not relate to this thing quite nicely, because in some sense, if you want to overlay metatype and metagram, it's going to, then you have to know how many people are, how many types of metatype personalities are operating the metagram circuits. Yeah, I mean, it adds a layer of complexity, but and in some sense, some of the kind of the ideological dishonesty, as it were. In fact, you might be, I might actually need to say how a particular metatype is likely facilitating the metagram mechanic, that you might be able to reverse diagnose that kind of thing as well. But just finding the actual field circuits structure that is being played on uh, itself might already make a lot of these interactions, or a lot of these phenomena within the social world and contemporary politics. It might bring it to bring some interesting things to light. Anyway, this is devolving into more and more embarrassing babbling, but so yeah, it's a bit sad that these things are still quite up in the air. In fact, as soon as I get some money, I'm going to print out uh, these diagrams that I've made, which are very nice diagrams. But yeah, I actually need to start cranking out the metagram mechanics themselves. But yeah, it's embarrassing because I've been working on this theory for so long, and and when I say things like that, it's almost like I'm back to square ground zero. I'm back to nothing. But I I do have a very good sensibility of all the parts of this puzzle, and I've developed the parts of these puzzle to such a refined degree that now, yeah, but I mean, sadly, foregoing that ability to have that uncanny confirmation is very sad, because that basically means that my model will just be a kind of some kind of very complicated philosophical treatise, and it won't deliver a kind of scientific proof of itself. Uh, the only thing that it might eventually be able to have going for it when it's done is it'll have self consistency and complexity, and perhaps some phenomenological predictions, and also psychometric tools that, when they are created, could perhaps have a lot of explanatory power. But that kind of knowledge system uh, was certainly won't be a science, although I would argue that it has been empirically um, investigated. Uh, but the real problem with science itself is that it's it operates by test, and there's certain things that I mean, perhaps I shouldn't be making general philosophical claims here, but I mean, there really is the problem with science is that you can only, first of all, you can't vindicate anything with science because it only delivers falsification. It doesn't ever deliver verification. And if something is unfalsifiable, it's essentially, perhaps these things are a bit touch and go, but I would say that then it's not a science. And I would agree that my whole philosophy and model and system would therefore not count as a science, because it will not be it will not be susceptible to falsification. Although, oh no, I mean, it will have some aspects of falsification, but those those will be completely independent scientific interpolations of the entire structure. So you could still it could still breed some kind of scientific parallel to it, but that will be somewhat another, and so in some sense it'll suffer from the same thing that Freudian thinking suffered from, is that if you can criticize it, it can refine itself to incorporate the criticism, and that it has enough moving parts and complexity that it can just kind of rearrange itself to any disturbance that one might mount at it. But in some sense, the axiomatic things that it claims are something like the 17 dimensions. And in some sense, the whole philosophical structure of creating the kinds of delineations that I have created. But then, the kind of the mechanical operations of how those elements interact with one another, I mean, that's just all basically empirical observation. And that is, in some sense, also not really prone to real falsification, but maybe something slightly akin to that. Uh, but that, you could just call that sort of interpretation or anecdotal. So I mean, in some sense, it could fall into the category of some kind of almost religious doctrine or some kind of philosophical school of thinking. But anyway, let me stop babbling about this. And that is still to hope that I'm even capable of rendering and cranking out an internally consistent structure, which is not fully done yet, but I anticipate and I hope uh, that it will. But at least I can. The frame is set now in some sense that I'm no longer looking for an uncanny alignment between metagram and metatype, because they're not going to plug in. They're not going to exactly fit together. Which, anyway. Which, this is really so many of the things that I say are horribly premature on some level as well, because I still haven't exactly reverse engineered why the 17 groupings of the metagram circuits, why they why they're why they're just grouped together, why are 48 metagram circuits put into 17 distinct boxes, 17 distinct categories, how just based on their I know it's based on their elemental signature. And somehow that needs to be reverse engineered and reconciled with the field circuits model to see how that kind of corresponds. So yeah, that needs to be done carefully to make sure that something wasn't there wasn't a clerical error, or that there wasn't some kind of erroneous element that now needs to be rethought. So that does need to be properly reverse engineered. Which anyway, I'm progressing quite quickly into doing that, and then I perhaps I'll have a much clearer vision of how these things are working, or how I have to. You see, this is the problem: is that this has to be done at the same time as thinking about the mechanics themselves. So there's a lot of things to sort of contain in one's head at the same time. Anyway, okay, so let me go on to elaborate on at least the psychological mechanism as I was talking about it or describing it, because I think that I can elaborate further into it. So I think it's even correct to kind of label this a kind of generalization witchcraft. Um, which I thematically link with this idea that the feminine is given this discretion within culture and society, in which they're almost awarded it as a kind of surplus and as a kind of, in some sense, a kind of separate but equal role. It is part of this toxic compact, or the traditional toxic compact of sort of separate but equal equality. Is that uh, uh, and I mean look, I'm slightly uh, condensing some of these things, and I'm not elaborating on them completely fully when I say that sort of when the masculine is gifting the bouquet of flowers, that the flowers are essentially a kind of um, that this is thematically a supplication to the female's ability to absorb some kind of surplus within the structure of things and use their discretion to demand symbolic homage be paid and that this is kind of meted out as a kind of control of through conventions and sociological um, uh, uh, conformity. Uh, but when the gift of flowers is actually happening, you could say, well, that's a willful concession that's being made. Then that the I mean, because I mean, I'm stretching that out into a generalization in some sense, or into a kind of into a general arc, or into a general process or mechanism. Whereas if it is specifically negotiated, or if, well, the masculine chooses to say that, okay, well, this is the bouquet of flowers that I am gifting, and I'm not saying that you have the power to define what counts as flowers that you would be happy to receive in being gifted, like that I'm choosing to buy the flowers, or so it's sort of, the concession could be particular, not a general concession that, oh, well, I'll just buy whatever is told is whatever is conventional, that I just have to go along with, and that you are the mouthpiece for telling me what is conventional, and what is fashionable, or something like that. So there's no explicit concession that the man will become an automatic supplicant, but the man is, some sense at least, providing a ritual or a token that he can be brought to bear. He can be brought into being, into carrying this convention and carrying this symbolic work, which then can be levied against him. So symbolic work, he's vulnerable to being brought to heel by some kind of symbolic convention. Anyway, this was Cato, the elders. Sort of. I mean, this is a complaint against the feminine essential qualia since antiquity. That the thing is that if you give in to a woman's license, when will it end? And they will eventually make you their slave. That was Cato the Elder's critique. And I would argue that this merely happens when when the social convention is no longer that a woman will pursue the value of the masculine, but only the masculine will pursue the value of the feminine, to speak for this, uh, merely to make her discretion known. And the idea is that that there's no counterpoint to defining the cultural significance, that it's just a unilateral dictation from the feminine receiver of the flower. It's just kind of taken for granted that some masculine agent will choose to provide the flower that is, in some sense, passively or implicitly um, set or levied as the kind of, as the market. Uh, uh, so I mean, and this has always been the power that women have wielded, is in some sense is setting the social convention. So in some sense, then women don't gain power as the individual in this hypergamous way of setting the price in the sexual marketplace. They have to create the impression of a customary price. So in some sense, that's the feminine cultural power, is the price of setting the custom. Um, and let's say the actual negotiation on the basis of psychological pricing, which could be, let's say, a two-way um, negotiation, is with the actual mechanics of relationship are engaged in, or this is a bit of an analogy, but anyway, the let's say the dance of psychological pricing gets completely sidelined by this now neutered cultural dispensation, because in some sense it's no longer customary for the woman to select for actual masculine energy, just for instrumentality towards satiating the feminine entitlement or expectation for flowers. Okay, so the the thesis that I'm trying to develop, though, is about so there's a bit of a complicated way to talk about those things, but that generalizations I've just lost my thread again, damn it. Okay, so this somewhat compacts with my loose thesis that if the generalization can't be interrogated or actually reverse engineered, or sort of re-engineered, or sort of played on or adapted or obscured, it's just kind of a take it or leave it proposition, because it's sort of it's so fixed that essentially the symbolic convention that is being set by the feminine is not up for negotiation, is not up for any kind of feedback that the masculine energy is providing uh, a distinct take, a distinct perspective on. It's just automatically overlooked or overridden by the feminine um, symbolic that they are solely entitled to demarking the symbolic conventional standard. Which is, it's interesting just how matriarchal the so-called feminist movement is, and also in some sense how toxically traditional it is in a lot of ways, and a lot of its sensibilities. It's quite ironic, these things about it. But the other point around this is that there that okay. So the main thesis that I wanted to get into was that when they get to have this unmitigated, unnegotiated, unilateral dictation of what the symbolic convention is, or whatever the general standard is, that you can't interrogate. You're not allowed as a man, as a masculine identity, whatever, you can't interrogate that generalization that is being laid down. And in some sense, you have to burden the contradiction, you have to burden the double standard in terms of how it's being contorted in some sense as well. You have to kind of absorb that you're being gaslit in order to make up for the. And I always forget, I had a very, very good definition of gaslighting that I produced quite a while ago, and but anyway, that's a tangent. But I gave I think, quite a perfect psychological rendition of what gaslighting is, and this will probably dovetail with that, although it's not going to be a reproduction of it at all. Um, that in their you know the way in which the generalization and the conventional standard is being used as a means to an end in terms of its, you could call it, sophisticated utilization, or it's I can't think of a good enough word actually for this, or the proper word for, I can't think of the proper word for this, but it's a co-opted uh, um, it's a strangely, it's being used in a very peculiar way, and it's used in a way that's fundamentally disintegrates the capability of people to be equal, because it says, no, no, this is the mark of our inequality, is that you must burden this differently to how I'm unilaterally dictating it. So I will unilaterally, as the feminine, dictate this, and you, as the masculine, will absorb the cost of it, or the contradiction of it. You will take the sin for its misuse. That I know that I'm consciously misusing it, and you must be scapegoated. But like that transaction, which is fundamentally sort of dehumanizing and denigrating, it's fundamentally sort of creates a schism in some sense, and that demarcation, that schism, uh, that the one person dictates the content of the generalization, and the other person has no access to renegotiating that content, and has to just kind of, and therefore it can be set up as a Trojan horse. It can be set up as a poison chalice, and the other person has to drink it and pretend that it's not poisoned as they're dying from it, as they're being undercut by it. And so this morbid morality play that comes out of this is, the kind of the sickness that we kind of suffer from in our current contemporary political and social consciousness, is that we're going through this, and you can see the sickly feminine. You can see the people who herald this mechanic, who perpetrate this. You can just, how overbearing they are, how they really have very unattractive qualities. It's incredibly condescending, essentially. It's built on a kind of unassailable conceit and arrogance, um, that's so certain in its objective narrative of things. Condescending, I think, is really sort of the main thing about it. But anyway, but as they do this, I've lost my main point now. What was my main thesis of this recording? The generalization witchcraft, which is used in a sadistically edged way, wherein one person gets to sadistically craft the standard, the conventional generalization, and the other person has to use it, never mind its appropriateness or its accurateness or its, or its inverse relationship to reality. It becomes a fiction that the other person has to live to atone for their systematic sin, to atone for their systemic oppression or something like that. And when is the end to the production of these social conventions and standards? It's you can't ask because you're not the producer of it. You're not part of the negotiation of constructing it in some sense. But there's some strange idea that this is the means to some higher end. Uh, so this, what was my thesis? This generalization witchcraft. In some sense, I think it also obscures. I mean, it very quickly runs out of any kind of moral pretense, I think. It becomes, a farce of a morality play quite quickly. The morality play that it seems to be acting out hollows out incredibly fast because essentially the mechanics of it are so manipulative in terms of the kind of the social control and how the social control manifests. The crafting of the generalization, which the other party then has to live out as their atonement, is you really have to try to work out how to extract some benefit from it, and this is such an indirect way to do it. So like the mechanism itself is like a broken mechanism. It turns reality into a surrealist, so it really disintegrates. It's unravels, uh, because sort of the fiction, the fictional aspect of it, because you see the fictional aspect of it has to center around some theme of moral accountability that is being apportioned to the perpetrator by some means of categorical um, collective blame and collective guilt. And so the collectivization of the justice, which is the exact opposite of the proper use of the term social justice. This is specifically what it means to be the victim of a social injustice. Because this is exactly the same engine as any kind of racial thinker or racist or bigot. This is the same moral computation done in bigotry. Is collective guilt, collective association with some moral crimination, some incriminating thing that is projected onto a whole group of people. Um, so that's the engine of this projection. But then you have to make this projection worthwhile. You have to craft a straitjacket which doesn't just diminish the other person, but somehow the diminishing of the other person has to create some collateral benefit. Otherwise, what's the even point of doing it? So this is why it's so inefficient at being transformative or useful in any way. So it's like, okay, well, if you believe the narrative that men have destroyed women and oppressed them horribly in the past, therefore it's right that now we have these quotas imposed on things, and so everything will become equal now because of some kind of imposed new stricture, some language code, okay, so when we're having an argument, you can't say something because then you are undermining women's equality or something like that. So you create some arbitrary ad hoc rules, some strange social conventions that restrain the other party, and somehow that restraint must equal a benefit. Somehow the restraint of the one party must automatically lead to some kind of benefit of the other. And in some sense, it's weird because it's true on some useless metric, usually. In some immediate sense, it can be seen as true, but holistically it doesn't pan out that way. So it's like, okay, so you can force yourself to win the argument because the other person isn't allowed to speak against something that you've already said. Well, that doesn't mean that what you said was actually correct. It just means that it stood uncontradicted. So being able to avoid contradiction is not the same thing as actually winning the argument on merit. So you end up winning an argument not on merit. So now, you shunt the problem you by the deficit in this gets somehow evenly distributed into the system. It just sort of it it to manifest somewhere else. It will so everything will slow down, everything will corrode, everything will be gummed up because this mechanism takes precedence, this mechanism of generalization witchcraft, and the whole system will just stop making sense. It'll become less and less reasonable. It will be less and less functioning according to reason. So everything will just kind of disintegrate. And then as things disintegrate, then you create more secondary and tertiary generalization witchcraft to blame the because you have this mechanism, so then you start using it to solve every problem because it's the perfect way to apportion problems in the structure of anything. So it becomes you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail suddenly. That's what it sort of turns into. But so I was going to make another point about the generalization witchcraft, though, is that I've said earlier about the in some sense it also relies on creating an orthodox mythology or narrative to justify this. The pressing narrative and the need to rewrite the narrative is so pressing that then you can continue this. In some sense, it's a kind of generalized dishonesty. The idea that you can abuse generalizations to somehow do moral work for you that can even fix history or fix the past or something like that. So, because we need to do something as absurd as changing history, therefore, let's use every trick at our disposal. And this magic trick of playing with morality and playing with generalizations gives somehow gives us the ability to transport ourselves into some strange new reconstruction of both history and reality and identity. Somehow we're solving everything at the same time, so long as we just keep on entrenching this unilateral bastion of dictatorial generalizations that then everyone, or at least the appropriate scapegoats, have to be burdened by and somehow atone by making true in their behavior, even if no one believes it. But there's a kind of conformity in just the ideological prescription. Anyway, so I still can't remember what my original thesis was about this. That something about the generalization witchcraft being a conduit for a sadistic, parasitic extraction of in this kind of morality play, where morality becomes an extraction from the scapegoat. But just talking about how essentially it also means that the categories that this narrative depends on, the category of male and female or races or whatever, all those categories have to be deeply concretized and crystallized and entrenched, because without that, uh, without because in some sense, and this is the dehumanization that the whole thing is based on, in some sense, is that you can't negotiate on generalizations. You can't, because you are not in the correct caste, you're not in the correct category to be able to dictate what the generalization should be. This is a theme from much earlier that is probably worth me properly elaborating now. Is that, in some sense, I think that women have had this traditional feminism and they've used it in culture for a long time, and you could argue perhaps that because I did think that we had this right in the 90s, I think that we did actually have a solution to all of this. And then we kind of went backwards. And I think that perhaps we might have gone backwards for political reasons. We might have gone backwards because, this is how plutocrats and oligarchs can easily make a population more susceptible to elite control and virtue signaling and things like that, because that means that political power then does not have to be wielded in a responsible way, because they can just virtue signal and they can just use this superficial morality play to disguise whatever else is going on. Uh, so I mean, there's okay, that's a bit of a conspiracy theory, but another way of looking at it though is that in each generation girls grow up, and in some sense we might have got a generation where they actually had the sense that equality, the ideology of equality, had been achieved. The non-racialism and non-sexualism of the 90s was essentially the end of the road. The finish line was in sight, and some generation of girls growing up didn't want to cross that line. They did not want to live in that new epoch, uh, because they saw it as a downgrade. They wanted the flowers. They didn't want to have a negotiated role in which that then they would also have to perhaps admire men more, because they would have to perhaps be in a better position to understand the attributes that make up the ideal masculine, or the honored masculine, or whatever, that how much energy and how much creativity and how much engineering goes into providing for things. That women in a more equal role would then have to say, oh yes, there are some brilliant men out there that have done amazing feats. Einstein was a male sex symbol. Einstein was a big cultural phenomenon. Male scientists were huge cultural symbols. People forget this. The masculine used to be masculine energy used to be was culturally valued. In a lot of variety, and all of that has been overshadowed by now the religion of the sacred victim, I guess, and also the narrative generalization witchcraft mechanism, and the condescending misanthropic manipulation of things. That actually is the general theme that I forgot about, is about control and manipulation. But anyway, let me finish this theme, because this is also an important theme. Um, so, oh man, what was this theme now? Oh, feminism. That I think that maybe a way of summarizing what all this identitarian acceleration is that woman needed an excuse, and I mean this in a vast generalization, that the cultural identity, the sociological construct of female or woman, needed to be radically updated according to the new equality standard of the 90s. But in actually revising that female identity, there was essentially a bit of a schism, because it was a fundamental downgrade. It would be a disempowerment. Because if women were to become little men, uh, or if we were all going to, as Sam Buckland talks about, the unisex. So this is me slightly connecting with this concept of the unisex, although I don't think yeah, I still think that this is probably a nuanced adaptation of that kind of thought. If women were to become little men, they would actually be diminutive, they would slightly be in awe that, of the Einsteins of the world. To put it bluntly, that, there has not been a female Einstein, essentially, is the thing that, or there are fewer female rock stars, there are fewer female Einsteins. They still have rock stars, they still have big, you know, um, but they have fewer ones. And so they kind of, uh, if they enter the male hierarchy, they're going to enter in the middle. They're going to cluster around the middle. So they might even, women on average might be better than the average man, but they're not better than the 1% of women are not better than the 1% of men, essentially. And that's a fundamental problem that uh, fully across the distribution, it's not an even keel, as it were. So that's a bit of a downgrade as a collective identity. It's a downgrade, and so that's a problem. Going from the receiver of flowers to collectively an identity that has a downgrade. And maybe not a downgrade in every metric, but on some metrics it certainly is a downgrade. And one might argue that it's predominantly on intelligence. And, and there are perhaps even evolutionary reasons for this. And I mean, this doesn't mean that there aren't female geniuses. Obviously, there are female geniuses. Somewhat the point is just that there are fewer female geniuses. I'm not going to go through the biological explanation of this. It's also somewhat obvious. Um, it has to do with selective pressure. More men get cut out of the gene pool than women do. Women have an 80% essentially chance to leave their genes behind. Men have much lower rate. So men have have they say pressure creates diamonds. Men have been genocided in every generation just for being inferior to other men, and especially when you don't have monogamy, um, uh, this exacerbates. So it's somewhat slowed down in recent times, but where you have polygamous structures, this phenomena that I'm talking about exacerbates, and this is a biological fact, or whatever, that we have already gone through a lot of time in the history of our species where men have been genocided in every generation. Essentially, inferior men have been genocided. So that's one of the reasons why we probably have a difference. And it has to do with selective pressure, and that selective pressure is also probably why there are a lot more male idiots. The If you look at male intelligence, it's all over the place, but that means that we have, relatively speaking, we have fewer people clustered in the middle, and we have more people on the extremes. We have more male idiots and we have more male geniuses. And relatively speaking, there are more average women that cluster around the middle, that for evolutionary reasons they have played it more safe because they have a kind of automatic biological value. They have an automatic value to the group, and that has, in some sense, had a cultural and a sociological probably um, correspondent structure. Okay, anyway, I said I wouldn't explain it, but that's basically what the story is. Now the more important point here is that if women are going to enter into a proper collective identity of a feminine, which has the same opportunity of equality, the the access to the same structures of status and prestige or whatever, if they have to get on the same level as that, then on many metrics they are going to um, you know so I do think that what's happened with identity politics is okay. So let me round this off because I've perhaps gone into too many tangents. Is that for a woman to negotiate this new collective identity, which is a downgrade in some respects, where they are no longer this traditional, mystical, moral superior. I mean, you must remember that was part of the traditional deal, is that women were not given the vote, not because they were seen as intellectually inferior, but the mythology was that they were morally superior to men, and therefore they should not have their moral sentiments clouded by technical policy, by intellectual concerns, that essentially that they shouldn't have their sentiments, their emotions, ideologically co-opted. Essentially, was basically that was the kind of the traditional mythology. So I think that this exacerbation of third wave feminism into identity politics is perhaps a giant way to, for the last time, I mean, this is me putting like a pretty spin on this, is to bring out the full brunt of the toxic feminist beast, to fully manifest the depravity, the the absurdity of it all, so that it can be culturally vanquished as a collective identity, so that it can be consciously brought under heel. That in some sense, that at some point you need to have a period of reconciliation in terms of manifesting, banking on the moral progress that has been made. So what I think what we're seeing is a cultural projection of that's happening on the level of sociological constructs that are being, you know, these demonic, idolatrous ideations of identity are being made manifest for us, so that we can see them vanquished by the already intellectual revolution that already sorted out these problems. All of these problems were already vanquished in the 90s. And perhaps you could say that they were vanquished slightly before then, but they were even manifest in the 90s. But in some sense, it's, this is like, the I don't want to say these things because they're going to mislead people as to what I actually believe, because I do think that this is the incorrect reading of the doctrine. But it's like that Christ had to die before he could come again. That when he comes the second time, that's when the kingdom of God comes. So you understand that it's the first time is a symbolic dry run, but the essence of it is fully laid bare. So it's the first time it happens, it's the first time Christ comes, it's an intellectual message, as it were. But it's when it happens the second time that it's actually embodied, as it were. But anyway, I do believe the second coming of Christ, which is always at hand, which means it's always accessible. This is for anyone to the kingdom of God is within you, So this is all. The end of the world in Revelations is the end of your world in the spiritual sense of these things. It's not an environmental historical morality play. It's a personal development. But anyway, and all these things that are being talking about in the dream of St. John is all the structures inside that make up the world and such, and make up your own psyche. The thing like the false prophets and the lake of fire, all of these things are. Anyway, or psychologize all of these things, or anyway. So what is my point here? My point here is that we already went through this in the 90s. It already happened. But now it's going to sort of happen again on the level of a kind of on that so I mean I do think it has to do with the process of radically revamping feminine identity away from the traditional monster that it was, and I do think that essentially part of the monstrous aspect of this, although this is not true in every, so you have to understand how this is thematically true, but not being particularly true in every case, but how I link it to the gifting of flowers. Which you can kind of, it probably makes the most sense. Gifting of flowers is, sort of what a very young child, maybe a very young boy child, might find a flower and give it to his mother. That sort of makes a lot more sense than some kind of courtship thing, which is supposed to happen somewhat between equals. Okay, that's perhaps trying to make a parallel, a juxtaposition to show the how the gifting of flowers creates this uneven um, cultural medium between the masculine and the feminine, or at least it creates a opportunity for a very toxic asymmetry and, let's say, a break in communication, or a disconnection of negotiated collaboration over at least the cultural production of generalizations and symbols and conventions. Um, and you could also say that men have always wanted to perhaps probably have a more say in cultural conventions and things like that. And you could probably say that there are probably different sensibilities, and there's certainly different interests between the sexes, generally speaking, between symbolic significances and conventions and generalizations, because we do have different perspectives, and a lot of those perspectives are quite slight, but there are, in aggregates, differences of perspective. I mean, hormones would contribute physiologically to some of those things. Literally just size, um, upper body strength. I mean, physiological things, but there are also other more ephemeral things. But I mean, there's also just some of these things have feedback with each other, but sort of just the fact in terms of reproduction, there are huge differences between males and females in terms of the act of reproduction. The male does not get pregnant. Uh, these asymmetries create, also in terms of how these fundamental differences have to be translated into legal things that govern certain issues. Like parental rights and a whole lot of other things. So, you know, the, or even in terms of framing success modes and failure modes for family units and relationships, there are differences in perspective between the sexes. Anyway, so the these things are all going to contribute towards there being different perspectives on what conventions should be, what generalizations should be, and there is some sense of power tug of war potentially happening there unless it's being negotiated in a very thorough, robust, and a forthright way to reach a high level of synthesis and um, and this always becomes a problem because there's always a temptation towards aiming for a lowest common denominator and some kind of general compromise that in its compromised form ends up providing safety and security, and in some sense usually one party's interests, or at least a subset of one party's interests, is going to perhaps be more emphasized or endorsed than another subset of interests. And this fractured nature or compartmentalization will then be the ingredients towards, it's interesting because what I'm talking, you can you can hear that someone was very much into dialectical materialism, or just the dialectic. What I just said is very reminiscent. If you've ever read Mao Zedong, um, anyway, the lots of parallels there in terms of let's say the understanding of cultural. Anyway, I shouldn't even mention that. That really complicates things, but that's a tangent. But I mean, let me just say that Hegel was a very clever guy with a lot of very clever ideas, and there obviously are going to be very interesting things that spawn from the Hegelian tree, that are usable, or at least are worth contemplating. But anyway, so I think that we are going through this. This is exactly what we are going through now. Um, and I would even say that perhaps I'm putting too much of an optimistic spin on this, and too much of a kind of assuming too much honesty, but that perhaps either the feminist movement didn't want to have this negotiation on its own, alone as the feminine identity, so it sort of tried to stir up some comrades in the black identity, and all these other identities, to co-opt a whole system of how important it is to have negotiated conventional sort of stereotypical generalizations around one's self-conception, and how that relates to society, and making sure that you have some kind of power, some secure power base within the culture based in your identity, not wanting to move into the non-racialist, non-sexualist mentality, in which you can still believe that there are differences between men and women as a non-sexualist. You can still have your personal preferences. You can still have your individual inclinations and disposition. You see, you really can have your cake and eat it. It just means that you have a certain idea of being responsible, um, or having some moral categorization of the thoughts in your mind, that they don't just produce a general narrative, and that you actually know that there's a difference between having a low resolution general narrative and having actual um, individual interactions with people. Uh, I mean, it's not that complicated. This is morality that every mother should have taught their child. Don't uh, judge a book by its cover. It's really quite that. So that doesn't mean to not have generalizations about books that have certain covers. You can have those generalizations. You can have those stereotypes. Just know that they're morally dangerous. Not it's not tough. That I don't think that requires any modicum of cognitive dissonance. That's the difference between being a rank uh, racialist bigot, and uh, being a natural, discerning human being, uh, or at least sentient being. Anyway, so sorry. So I think that I actually quite like that the feminist movement has roped in the black identity, for instance, because there was a lot of black racialists for a long time who have been given lots and lots of cover, lots and lots of in their protection racket, in their toxic subcultures and their vulnerable narcissism and their you know disgusting morality that ends up producing more of its own self uh, uh, sort of infantilization and its own self propelled victim narrative that sort of gets in the way of actually solving problems, because it ends up creating this scapegoat diversion instead of actually focusing on the real cause of the problem. Instead, it systematizes the cause instead of localizing it. And you can't do anything against a systematic problem. You can only do something against a particularized local issue. And again, problematizing individuals and saying that they are the problem because they're not willing to believe in and act out the standard of conventional generalization, which has been ideologically fashioned for them to act out in a kind of social manipulation. That's the other point. But yeah, the social control, the sadistic generalization witchcraft. So let me get back to that. But so yeah, I'm sorry, I'm talking about so many things at the same time. So yeah, I think I've made this point, and maybe in an earlier recording, that I think that this is why women have done this, is because they need to renegotiate, or they need to publicly, as it were, revamp the feminine identity, to update it maybe. And they're doing it publicly because in some sense they are vigorously defending the traditional privilege that women have always enjoyed, and they are trying to see if they can get away with smuggling it into the new the new moral edifice that came out of the 90s, which now they're kicking and screaming against and trying to provide perhaps cover for it as well. Um, so that they are, it's being steelmanned in some sense. The traditional female identity is being steelmanned before our eyes, and it's certainly a monstrous threat to civilization. Even it's a monstrous threat to clean government. It's a liberal democracy. It's to any kind of rigorous justice system. It's essentially, it is the intellectual underpinning of fascism, quite overtly. And in this state, it has to be suppressed. It has to be um, it has to be criticized. It has to be vanquished in some form. Uh, and in some sense, I think that it should not be culturally quashed. I think the best way to do it is to leave it alone, but to create independent structures and institutions that have a filter that keep it outside. I don't want to kill it. I think it should never end, and in some sense it should be understood as being a circle of hell. And then it can be those that live in that circle of hell wish to do so, and those that don't have their own different institutions, have their own different forms of government and justice systems and court systems. And so, I'm very happy to have it manifest within reality, because I think it's a it's a beautiful exemplification of, in some sense, the spiritual truth that is undergirds human psychology, etc., etc. Okay, so there's that. And then I was going to say about the social control. Yeah, because, I mean, you can see it. It is through this identity system, it's really capable of constructing social standards and moral codes and superficial generalizations, which the scapegoat and the ideological perpetrator has to be bound by. And while they are being bound by it, they are like the puppet, and they have to act. They're being puppeted to self harm, and somehow that brings atonement and redemption of the entire system, because it's their identity that just needs to be cut down to size. So people are being punished for their identity, and the idea is that the identity is where all the hidden treasure is where all the leprechaun gold is. That somehow, when you destroy the male identity, when you destroy the patriarchy in terms of its social standing, then somehow everyone is getting richer and everyone's getting more equal. And it's these things are just completely, it's just nonsense. Um, it's just their fictional morality play. But in some sense, they just get addicted to their own social control and manipulation. And in some sense, the biggest disparity between the genders, between male and female, is that in some sense, female has never been held accountable. The female has never been held to the same standard of moral integrity. That people say that, oh, black men go to jail for the same crime at a much higher rate than white men, but no one ever asks the question between female and male. And by the way, I think that probably the disparity between black men and white men uh, probably has to do with the fact that, uh, yes, we could say that it's structurally caused in some way, that in some generalization way, that structurally in America, black men are more likely to be violent offenders and criminals and these sorts of things because of the destruction of the black family and all these sorts of things, and drug abuse, which is also probably, or at least in some times in history, had a disproportionate correspondence between group statistics between black and white. But these the idea that you're going to say that the generalization of structural inequality or whatever means that it's racist that black men are going to jail more, is a very strange way of making a technical point that should have no moral baggage to it. In some sense, it's just another piece of propaganda to say, oh, we need to blame the system, or that somehow white people are to blame, or that, somehow, well, black men shouldn't be sentenced for doing the same terrible thing. Because it's the system's fault that the numbers are so out of proportion with the general population, the proportion that people are to the general population. It's the whole thing is, it's such a superficial sort of confabulation of moral language. I mean, yeah, I would say that is also an example of this kind of generalization witchcraft, uh, that you're going to dilute the criminal culpability of individual people and somehow say that all the structure is to blame. And in some impersonal way, the structure is to blame, but that generalization doesn't hold and is morally amoral. It is a fundamentally amoral generalization. And don't mix amoral generalizations with things like criminal culpability and uh, self possession, self ownership, and responsibility and self determinism. Because as soon as you don't treat people like individuals, then really the only real way to actually have any kind of functioning society is to immediately segregate society into separate but equal compartments or something like that. Or it doesn't matter if you call them separate or equal or not, but you have to sequester groups and you have to separate them, because otherwise there's, without that kind of parity of the individual, then people are only going to represent an, too much of an opportunity of outsourcing or externalizing or projecting excuses for behavior. And then you've got essentially a psychologically um, enslaved, an intellectually benighted uh, impediment, and also a kind of moral straitjacket to be controlled by whoever controls the unilateral narrative of saying and diverting blame onto some, through some generalization witchcraft, onto some agent, some perpetrator, which is held out as a kind of as an icon of of the social injustice, a way to both disperse the blame onto the system and then to concentrate it into a scapegoat, both of which I think are fundamental mechanics of sort of the fascistic scapegoating sort of psychotechnology, which, when as soon as you start using it, I think you're on the path towards collapse. You're on the path towards sort of a fundamental hollowing out, because as I described earlier, it just explodes into gumming up and eroding reason from everything, because part of the generalization witchcraft is that there is this fundamental categorical divide being produced, and between that categorical divide, the generalization cannot be properly interrogated. In fact, the generalization is constructed dishonestly in order to somehow facilitate some immediate extractive disequilibrium, which is essentially the atonement for the sin of the system. So, you're basically saying that only some people should pay for the problem in the system, instead of saying that no, 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 it's not some people should pay and some people shouldn't pay. It's that we should actually just treat it like a pragmatic problem. We should say, what is the easiest way to fix the problem? Not what is the easiest way to balance the ideological grift or balance the narrative. It's not what's the easiest way to put the narrative in some kind of equilibrium, some kind of polemic equilibrium. It's, well, actually, let's just treat the problem like a kind of technocrat, or like a kind of, instead of trying to treat morality like a kind of technocratic sort of circus act of having a what are they called? The ringmaster. And now I'm back to the analogy of the Lord of the Rings, maybe. The one ring to rule them all, that makes you invisible to the systems, that you can go around and invisibly be the hidden hand, and try to correct the narrative from somehow being outside the system yourself, that you can actually construct these generalizations to as a means to an end, to bring equilibrium to the narrative, this external locus of control, which then you have to believe in as a mythology that's more than real, that's hyper real, that's the only thing that matters anymore. This disgusting social psychology that is fundamentally entrenched in a racialist identitarianism and a racial consciousness. Anyway, okay, I've gone around and around a few times now. I think I'm going to finish this recording, but it's sort of, yeah, I think I didn't focus on the narrative well enough about the social manipulation and the control. Okay, I'm really jumping around here quite badly, but yeah, this is was under the heading of thought catalog, so I guess that's my excuse. But so just to put a finer point on the lack of confirmation that that in some sense the whole structure of my endeavor was hoping to do, to make it sort of more scientifically robust in terms of having a level of internal consistency that would validate both systems, and why that is essentially a failed hope at this point. And essentially the reason why it's a failed hope is because metatype and metagram independently, separately, looks like that they are not capable of rendering a full picture of cognition, that they are fundamentally commingled, they're fundamentally interdependent in some sense, in a kind of functional sense, although they are not necessarily interdependent in terms of some layer of understanding, but they're not independent enough to give a full description of cognition. And so because of that, they can't independently align with each other and have a kind of uncanny correspondence that kind of proves the structure. Um, but I can still have a kind of consolation prize or a kind of second prize, which is, well, how they intermingle and how they interlock is a peculiar and unique sort of thing, and that peculiarity should manifest as particular phenomenological, verifiable, kind of it'll basically, in some sense, how the bridge between the two will should directly correspond with what psychology looks like in terms of when people are developing their personalities. It should somewhat be the content of, let's say, developmental obstacles, or something like that. So the kind of the uncomfortable intermingling of them will itself provide um, substance and content that should then be, let's say, independently verifiable, but that will be based on some kind of phenomenological peculiarity and structure and things like that. So anyway, I just wanted to say that. And then, as I'm starting to narrate this, I've started to try to work towards having stable semantics and jargon. So, um, how I'm characterizing this now, and maybe these will be useful words, that essentially metatype is a model of the cognitive operator and the components or subcomponents of cognitive operators, that holistically together make a particular sentient, conscious, conscious being, a human sentient, and that the 17 cognitive functions, you could call them maybe cognitive operator components. So these cognitive operator components are operating, and what they are operating are cognitive forms, which are the emotional tones and the metagram cognitive compounds. And the model of cognitive forms is, in some sense, a kind of also a model of processing. So, in some sense, you can't have cognitive processes without metagram. So, the cognitive operator is performing operations via cognitive forms and the processing structures, and all the processing structures are essentially metagram structures, and so they are the thing that is the closest thing to having an objective external reality in some sense. They're almost like um, a set of a priori you can't even call them really a priori, but it depends on what you want to take as the reference point. But in contradistinction to the metatype cognitive operator, metagram is essentially the only thing through which that you can sort of process cognition through. So you have to try to see yourself through the structure of processes, which you can the only the karmic mirror is metagram, and the operator or the soul or something like that is something like metatype. And I guess either one, you could maybe argue that the structure of either one, maybe the structure of both could be argued. The fundamental modeling of that, you could argue, are both a priori sort of metaphysical um, built-in things, but in some sense the metagram is only it's sort of, it happens in practice. So it's kind of I don't know, maybe a priori is not a useful distinction here, because metagram is in some sense intrinsic to a kind of phenomenological a posterior kind of manifestation. But anyway, and the thing is that the how metagram is being operated is that it's not being operated as a solid state. It's being operated at least in two circuits. So there are two metagram entities that are simultaneously being operated within the metagram field circuits, and through the emotional tones, and through identification with emotional tones or associations with or imprints. So the metatype is imprinted itself with a kind of with metagram emotional tones, and but these imprints are in two separate structures or two separate circuits. And so how these two circuits are intermingling with each other through metagram is also going to have a propitiative metatype, um, a secondary or an independent of metagram. It's going to have a metatype um, significance or meaning on the structure of metatype. And the structure of metatype, therefore, is a kind of, I do think it is a picture of the soul in some sense, and it is distinct from, let's say, the karmic drama or the actual processes or structure of some project or procedure that will have a kind of natural, mechanistic, almost karmic, kind of potentiality, that it will have a peculiar metatype internal style of how it is attached, or of how it is um, an extension from metatype, in terms of how these two circuits are being simultaneously supported from the metatype operator. Is there anything else that's worth talking about? Anyway, so I'm on the way to just creating some, and so I mean this also is, I think, what demarcates the development into adulthood, or sort of, you can see that children, their psychology changes from as they're turning into teenagers, or as they're approaching sort of their teen years, sort of the transition from uh, sort of maybe 8 to 7, or 7 years old, from between 8 years old and 11 years old. There, I think that there's a distinct transition there, and that transition is, I think, the 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 regular mediation or homogenization of these, of essentially the primary counteroffer superego circuit, is getting into a kind of a fixed regular alignment with the stimulus emergent response circuit. And I don't want to talk about this too much, because there's a there's a more detailed, delicate, and technical way of depicting this, which I need to make a proper presentation on. Um, and I also need to think about it as well, the mechanics around this. But let me preemptively speculate slightly that, from what I've been staring at and from the drawings that I've made of this so far, is that the primary counteroffer establishes itself first, which is the imprint on the unconscious side of the mind. So it's held within the unconscious inferior function. And there are a lot of commingling mechanics which make this quite complicated, but essentially that there's a metatype ontological developmental line of progression, and then there's a kind of sympathetic or consequential metagram circuitry. And when both metagram circuits are fully operating, because the metatype has gone through its kind of ontological spin up, has got itself, it's fully cycled a few times, it's fully machined, it's fully it's in some kind of regular pattern, it's in some kind of habitual recurring structure, and that takes a long time for both circuits to be in that kind of stable state relative to one another. And then when they're both in a stable state relative to one another, then the metagram, in some sense, the internal locus of control and external locus of control, the C's are calm enough that it can either try to make a stable external locus of control, or try to create some kind of mythology, or some kind of management system of the metagram circuits themselves. And usually there'll be some kind of crystallization of some kind of stable, knotted off some kind of compartmentalized internal locus of control, with other things that then are relegated into an external narrative and scapegoated, and an external locus of control. And so, in some sense, because of the inexactitude, I'm going to guess that essentially, and this is perhaps what goes through culture, why we go through, sort of the four ages, or the four, sort of the cycles of culture, is that it's almost like a fashion that, because people have false ego complexes and they don't properly regulate them with a proper, mature spiritual understanding and an internal locus of control, they end up having to create an external narrative to kind of soak up the cognitive dissonance. And there are like let's say there are four different aspects, there are four different compartments that you can do this to. And in some sense, in culture, there will be there will be almost like a kind of incentive from a kind of this is from almost like a sociological secondary, sort of thing, is that, well, you can't just replicate blindly what your culture seems to be doing about it. You have to kind of discover it within your own phenomenology, within your own psychological structure that is being developed. And so you can't just mimic it. You can mimic it, but you will have a tendency towards reverse engineering it and doing it your own way. So there's a kind of there's perhaps a kind of a natural ebbing towards some, that you're going to kind of try to maybe one up the model that you are mimicking, or the model that you have to work with. So you look at culture, you look at society, you see how people are doing it, and you can see that, I mean, look, there might be other reasons for this. This is slight speculation, but you can talk about the psychology of the 50s and the 60s. I can't remember what the phrase is to describe it, but it's very ego focused. It's focused on trying to have a strong ego, and they do this by almost culturally banishing ego inquiry, or ego that you know I have a very, this is a weak example of this, but I had a shred of a thought that, when you're looking at the 70s even, or I don't know, or when this came out, or in the 60s, this is the dawning of Aquarius, that whole pop song, this is the dawning of Aquarius. It's like, how ironic can you be, that you're going to sing about spirituality as something that's happening to the time, that, sort of it belongs to the zeitgeist. It's, this kind of, we're being bathed in this perennialism, but, this is how they conceive of sort of seeing, perhaps having some sensibility that their psychological structure is kind of is at the end of its tether. It's sort of it's at the end of one cycle, and a new cycle is waking up, or something like that. And but because they don't have, let's say, the introspective responsibility to develop this into an understanding or internal locus of control, they sing, this is the dawning of Aquarius. um, it's a bit of a weak example, but anyway, I didn't quite articulate that point exactly, but it's something like that. um, so they almost have to take something and they have to turn it into not something that is understood, but a kind of a collective of event, uh, that they are just a cog and that they are a part of, but that, it's sort of, it's happening to them. It's being done to them in their time, in their collective. It's not being done to their understanding in some sense, or their understanding is fundamentally sort of opaque to and insulated from this process. So my point is that, when they're singing that this is the dawning of Aquarius, what they're really doing is they're singing about their own state of of depravity to some extent, or a kind of they're affirming their own spiritual ignorance in a quite an ironic almost way, because them saying that this is the dawning, well, why isn't Aquarius already dawned? It's because they have to frame it as this is the dawning of Aquarius. That's why they're in the Dark Ages. Is basically my point. Anyway, so so you can see that there's no introspection against the ego. That's my other point, is that their whole culture and their whole is basically that the ego is hands off the ego. Don't interrogate it. Don't question it. Don't discern its quality or its essence. We just because it's not the ego's fault. Somehow it's the perennialism of the time. It's the zeitgeist. It's just the event of the ages or something like that. It's God becomes a kind of Chronos, becomes the god of time. It's completely alien to the understanding, to the human intellect, to the spiritual being, to the spiritual discerning. It's just, that's all opaque, that's all murky, that's all just overshot completely and overshadowed. Okay, so my point is that so it's very ironic. This is the dawning of Aquarius. They're singing about themselves. They're not singing about the time to come. Although that's also, perhaps you could argue that it's a self-fueling prophecy there. And so I would even argue that that's also the characteristic of the false prophet, is they're making their own prophecy true in some sense, but uh, it comes from having an inability to have a proper responsibility, a proper humility, a proper introspection. It's all based on essentially externalizing it onto a collective experience or onto the outside environmental conditioning or something like that. It's a condition of the time, it's a condition of the environment. It's has nothing to do with their own spiritual internal whatever. That's how kind of dead they are in spiritual terms. Anyway, so my point is that, okay, so maybe I could say that, well, so you could say that maybe in culture what happens is that one of the sides of the mind, or one of the metagram circuitry things, is taken to be sacrosanct. So like the emergent response is very much the center of the ego, in terms of the metagram representation of the ego, what the ego has imprinted on its inferior function. So maybe the ego, and this is definitely speculation. I'd have to confirm this later, but so maybe in some times, in some ages, the ego becomes the fixed axle, the fixed point of reference, and everything else has to kind of make room for the ego, make room for the emergent response, emotional tone. So everyone's emergent response is untouchable, is hands off, and everything else, kind of works around that. And that's a stable cultural format or something like that. And so everyone can shunt their cognitive dissonance onto their other onto their other sides of the mind. So the other sides of the mind have to sort of tie themselves in knots to make room for the emergent response. Something like that. And then at some point, it's not just that there's one fixed point. It's specifically, there has to be a weak point that is taking the strain of the fixed point. So any kind of rigidity about the emergent response means that something else has to give way. And so maybe that there's a collusion, there's a cultural consensus as to which side of the mind and which other aspect is taking the strain for the strength of this of the emergent response. And then that shifts around, that weak point then migrates to another weak point. And eventually all the permutations get exhausted, and then culture wants to flip the script and wants to move on to the next thing. And then eventually the emergent response gets shifted from being the focal point to another cultural consensus gets formed around creating a bastion around another metagram element. Or technically these are metatype elements, I guess, like the stimulus or the primary counteroffer or the emergent response. So the stimulus is a representative of the subconscious, and the primary counteroffer is a representative of the unconscious, but it can also be argued to vaguely be a representative of the superego as well. And it is also more complicated than this, and I'll have to show my diagrams to show that. But I'm just giving a general kind of outline narrative of how I see these things actually working. And then, obviously, the thing is that the metatype, because these two circuits, because essentially the stimulus and the emergent response and the primary counteroffer are two separate metagram simultaneous things that are being operated on the metagram field circuit simultaneously. And the connection between these two things is internally devised, is internally developed through a particular individual's maturation. And so they have to work out which of their components is going to take the strain and which of their components is going to be more of a because it's kind of an internal shouting match between these things. And in some sense, if you're not going to have self-actualization, if you're not going to properly integrate the shadow and properly integrate the primary counteroffer, which has the kind of the superego kind of looming around it, with the stimulus and the emergent response, then you're going to have to knot off that cognitive dissonance into some kind of external locus of control or scapegoat, or bottle it up inside in some way or something like that, and have some kind of way of understanding this in terms of it's going to be represented in all the sides of the mind in some way. Whatever you do to any side of the mind is somewhat going to be represented in the other sides of the mind, either in the metagram circuitry or in the metatype, let's say, conduit of the two metagram circuits. So what's the point here? So people are going to, especially when they're growing up and developing, they are going to in somewhat be inundated and surrounded with examples of adults using their own psychology, using their own psychological schema, and then these can be used as templates. These can be used as examples of how they could develop. It's examples of psychotechnology. They're being exemplified psychotechnology for them to imbibe and reproduce within themselves, to reverse engineer inside themselves. And they are going to, in some sense, also see for themselves that the examples of success and failure, the examples that, well, some adults have this psychotechnology and they have a certain, this is where role models come in, like they have a certain, well, they're strong, they have weaknesses and they have strengths. That maybe they have a very integrated psychology, but they seem to don't do well in the world in some other way. And so there's a whole way contextualizing what success means. And based on that, essentially you might say that there will be a general tendency towards developing psychotechnology that will enable let's say, survival and success within a particular context. And so, there are going to be incentive structures in some sense towards gravitating towards the herd, conforming to other people's structures, or at least being compatible with other people's structures, if not conforming and mimicking and copying them, but at least being compatible with them. And so then you can see that why there would be a propensity towards a kind of migration or a transition between one age and another age, which would be somewhat related to psychology. And maybe the four ages have to do with there being four field circuits, or maybe it has to do with the fact that there are four sides of the mind, or at least three. Because I said that there are four sides of the mind, but in terms of how metatype actually plugs into metagram, there are only three. Those four get condensed into three in terms of how they populate the field circuits, and then those three objects within the field circuits, some of which are compound objects, in that they're not just one thing, they are two things, but they are the same. They're being operated in the same breath, or something like that, or at least, or they're being operated in the alternative. Uh, so there are some of these metagram things are have some options of how the metatype is operating the metagram circuitry. That the metagram circuitry has an alternative. You can use this one or you can use that one for some of the circuit types. Anyway, and then that essentially that those structures also, in terms of metatype, can be subdivided into two circuits from a kind of metatype perspective, and they can also then interrelate with one another in lots of different ways in terms of metagram, because each of these three things can link up with each other. So 3 to the power of 2 is how many different, sort of interwoven metagram interconnections might exist between these things. And then the complication of there being also a subdivide between two circuits that are bridged by metatype. So you have metagram interconnectivity and a kind of metatype contradistinction between two separate circuits that is creating the complexity of psychology, or the complexity of phenomenological experience. Anyway, it's very... Okay. That's enough sort of me talking about this. I need to start trying to describe it meticulously with diagrams and such, because it is too complicated just to talk about.